Hi everyone, welcome to Advancing with Watercolor. I'm Gary Tucker. This week I'm going to be talking about how the artist trains their eye to recognize patterns in nature and how they develop their skill to render these patterns with effective brushwork. It's one of the challenges that we engage in when we're training our vision, when we're looking at nature. We take a very complex scene and try to reduce it to elements which can be repeated. I think you're noticing that already in this painting of the Glaze Bridge, which is another Venetian scene that I had the chance to see this summer. Have a look below where you can find a description in a PDF form that describes in greater detail how the artist develops their vision so that they can perceive patterns in nature and then bring those to the painting. Well, we're back in Venice, and this week I'm going to focus on painting the Glaze Bridge in Venice, and you'll notice it in the distance in this photograph. What you also notice are the Pali da Casada, the large vertical poles that are brightly decorated with colors. And I'm using that as a major theme in this painting, and I want to show them emerging from the shadows and against the Glaze Bridge and the distant buildings across the canal. This is important to me because I found a sort of visual interest in these poles, and I believe that they can create a sort of theme or a sort of tempo or musicality to the painting. And so that's what I'd like to focus on. And in this early stage where I'm drawing the big shapes and the other elements, I'm placing them with an eye towards variation. Because they're a repeated element, a danger is to make them all the same height or the same distance or the same spacing, and that wouldn't look good in the final painting. So variety is a thing that I'm striving for as I'm designing the painting. And I'm laying out a few colors after placing the design, and I'm relatively happy with the placement of the Pali da Casada and the boats and the bridge. I'm starting to think about a watercolor plan and how to move forward in terms of layers, because this is going to be a bit of a challenge because we're going to be painting not in between objects but over washes. So I'm starting to mix a few colors here, primarily yellow ochre and burnt sienna. And the idea is to create a bright luminous background of buildings being hit by the sun, and then follow that with a darker application using cooler colors in the foreground to push back against this scene. I do want to create a graded wash. We've been talking about graded washes over the past few weeks, and they're very effective to create movement, especially if you're trying to describe the movement of light. So the light is coming strong from the left-hand side, which means I'd like to put a graded wash moving from left to right. Test. Have that wash describe the light as it moves across the scene. Records using I'm using a second graded wash in the canal, Pro starting with a pale yellow ochre and gradually adding a bit of cobalt turquoise to that color so that I get a feeling of distant shore, and then as the wash deepens it pulls the eye, it makes it feel like it's coming closer. So I'm using those two washes in a graded aspect to set up the background. I'm also going to be applying a third graded wash into the sky area because I want that to also have a feeling of movement to it, the feeling that the light is coming from the left-hand side and moving towards the right. If you glance back at the photo, these things are not so apparent. They're exaggerations or embellishments that I'm adding based on what I would like to see in the scene. And through past paintings, I know that I can do this most effectively through a graded wash. And so that's what I'm doing. And then as I build up the foreground, you see me also applying a warm hue. This is not going to be the final color, but I'm applying it so that I can bring out some of that warmth, reflected warmth from the distant buildings, and bring that into the foreground as well, using watercolor's transparent nature. So these are part of my watercolor plan, things that I have planned for and want to build into my painting. Well, we've let the whole painting dry, and you can see that it's dried quite a bit paler. And the shapes are a little amorphous at this point, but I'm counting on this darker application that I'm starting now. Using a cobalt blue and a bit of burnt sienna, I want to create the bridge itself, the Gouglier Bridge, and establish those obelisks that are at the ends of each bridge. And I want to use this strong mid-tone to push back against the view of the city in the background and make it recede. At the same time, I hope that's going to concentrate the feeling of light moving through the scene. And I'm going to continue this tone, this mixture of ultramarine blue, a little cobalt blue, and a little burnt sienna on the left-hand side. Buildings that rising on the left-hand side, as well as the foreground area of pavers that forms the edge of the canal. And I'm using basically the same color mixture, which looks apparently flat and gray, but as I'm carrying it down, I'm adding a portion of burnt sienna, a portion of cad red, a portion of blue, to try and give some variation to this gray. As it's occupying a large space, I want to make sure that there's some variation. Now, as I'm starting to create the boats, I'm going with a little stronger color. I don't expect this to be the finished result, but I want to create a little bit of distinct edging or distinct color in the final version of this boat. These boats are kind of facing upstream and also in shadows, so there won't be a lot of detail shown in the boat itself, but rather some edges left and some edges against a bright canal. That should be enough to kind of give us the impression that a boat is resting here. And then we're going to surround it by bullocks and also by the Pali da Casada to make it feel as though it's nestled and waiting for use. And we'll put a few other boats. You can see one I've already painted in that similar blue-gray towards the top of the bridge, and here you can see the full complement of boats. And you see it's basically just a silhouetted shape with a few left edges to give us a feeling of highlights. Well, now I'm going to start to paint the Pali da Casada themselves, and I'm zooming in to show you what the brush looks like as it's traveling down the page, because it's a view that I think will give you a little more information on creating these sorts of marks. Putting a little bit of weight on the brush so that I can kind of keep a straight line. This helps me to keep a straight line as the brush comes down towards the edge of the canal. You'll see that it's dried out a bit and it's leaving sort of a partial mark of a dried brush effect. And I'm going to continue this through all the poles, but I wanted to show you in particular how I'm making this type of mark. I'm using a bit of ultramarine blue, and I'm returning to the top of it after painting the mark. I'm returning to the top of it to give a little darker application where we see the peak of the pole. And this is where we'll put a little bit of a decorative element to the pole and add some of the ridges and the finish that makes it look so interesting and so appealing. So I go up to the top, and I'm using a fairly pointed brush. You can see it's this sablette that I like to use, and it gives me control to add these fine marks that help to really finish off the pole in a nice way. And I'm going to continue this sort of painting of each pole and then finishing it at the top with a little bit of extra cobalt blue to give the sort of shadowed feeling that I want, have that blue kind of come up from the bottom and extend into the pole. And then later on I'll be adding the decorative marks. Well, now you can see the painting and appreciate how the color is dried in the foreground. I think when it's in its wet state, it's a little difficult to notice how or anticipate how the warm hues are going to come through this application of the blue-gray that I added. But they're starting to appear now, those light hues of orange and yellow ochre. And those combine with the buildings in the background to give a real feeling of sunlight and bouncing light in the scene, which is another thing that I wanted to achieve in this painting. At this stage, I'm starting to place the windows using a small brush, dry brush technique. And since the poles are in place and since everything is kind of in place, it makes it a little easier to place the windows. I am not following any of the photograph at this point because I want the windows to be complementing the other elements that are at play in the foreground. So what I'm doing is working in between the poles and working on the lines of perspective that I established in the buildings in the background, and using a mixture of yellow ochre, burnt sienna to paint the windows. And since the poles have dried, I can also return and paint the striping on the poles. And I'm not trying to be perfect about it. I'm concerned with the width of the mark, the angle of the mark, and just making a simple mark. I'm not trying to fashion it to make it look like it's rounding the pole, but just adding a mark, and as it dries it looks pretty good. Also, we want to add some of the pavers. This helps make the shadow area feel more transparent and more lively. So a lot of work in the shadows, and placing these pavers into the shadows is a strategy I use a lot to make the shadow feel transparent. And when we make it feel transparent in this way, suddenly the shadow feels less cumbersome, less opaque, less heavy, and has a lighter quality to it. Even though it's quite dark, these sorts of elements can liven up the piece. And as a final touch, I'm adding a couple figures, um, one walking towards us, another looking out towards the canal with his terrier. And I think when you paint an urban scene, you have to include figures of some sort. Otherwise, it looks apocalyptic, and we don't want that to be the image kind of circulating through people's minds. So I'm adding a few figures near to me. I'm also adding some figures on the bridge and populating the scene this way. Well, I'm adding the finishing touches to the painting, and those include some highlights on the figures, just to, again, to create the feeling of some light bouncing into the shadows, hitting the shoulders, anything that's kind of facing skyward. I would consider adding a highlight to. The highlights on the boats, I'll be adding some highlights to the top of the Pali da Casada as well. In looking at the piece, I feel the sky has paled a little more than I want it to. So I'm doing a little bit of a glaze here. I'm using a little orange, as you can see, up in the sky, and making sure it's wet through the sky, and then I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine blue to, again, kind of compact the strong light that's moving through the buildings on the far shore. To help the movement of the color, I'm going to tilt it on its side and let gravity pull it down just a little bit, make the transition a little smoother. And then we'll turn the painting over and see how it's dried. While I'm finishing up the painting, I'd like you to have a look at the description below, where you can see links to videos of a similar nature. You can also see materials that I used in this painting, as well as a PDF that provides a little more information on my decisions in making this painting. Thanks for joining me, everyone. I hope today's painting was helpful in showing you how the artist looks at the world and sees patterns, and how they're able to bring those patterns to life in a complex painting. Have a look below at the description, which provides more information on how the artist looks at the world. It also shows a list of materials that I'm using in this painting. And you can find a PDF file that links to a file that describes in greater detail some of the concepts and techniques that I'm using in this painting.